Welcome, students of EDU 290. We have a special guest today. And actually, I don't know why I'm saying this because this is recorded. So this is not good. But you guys know I'm crazy anyway, so we're just going to roll with it. So I am recording this session with special education teacher Kevin Ryan Miller because I know him as Ryan, even though he's probably like, that has nothing to do with my name. So I'm going to let him tell a little bit about himself. And we're talking to him because this week's focus of instruction is special education and teachers as advocates and how we work with diverse learners as well as special education teachers. So, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, where you teach, how long you've taught, to give my students some context, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. As Keisha said, my name is Kevin Miller. This is my third year teaching. I currently teach at a public behavioral alternative school in the suburbs. Um, I've been in a couple different placements. Before this, I was in a different alternative public school, which was more uh, the emotional side of special education opposed to the behavioral side. We call them like internalizers and externalizers. Just the way that the students show their emotional disabilities. And then before that, I did a maternity leave with students with severe cognitive disabilities. So yeah, I've been in a few different placements in my short educational career. Um,
Awesome.
yeah,
Awesome. Well, thanks for talking to future educators because you're not far removed from where they are now. So,
not
how
at
would
all.
you describe and define your role as a special education educator?
Um, so currently, my role is I teach many classes in an alternative setting. There is no gen ed teacher, so uh, us teachers are teaching all the subjects, and that's not uncommon for special education teachers who are in specific programs. So I have a math class, I have an English class, I have a history class, and I also teach physical education. Um, Aside from teaching the content, I'm also a case manager, which is um, the person like in charge of the students' IEPs. So I'm the one that writes the IEPs for my caseload. So my set of students that I take care of. I communicate with their families often, and then I advocate for their needs, whether that's putting in accommodations or modifications for my own classes or talking to their other teachers about what my caseload students might need or benefit from in their classes. Um, and then, kind of unique to my building, I'm also in charge of my caseloads, uh, kind of restorative justice practices. So if they get in trouble for some reason, I work with my administrator to come up with a good restorative justice technique for those students to get them back on the right track.
How many students on your caseload?
Currently, I have six. Um, Last year, I had eight or nine. We have not had as many students coming to us this year because uh, of the weird virtual slash hybrid year.
Because is it because they're just it's harder to identify them in this space or
That and with students online, it's harder to identify a behavioral or emotional need, and students are getting in trouble at the home schools less if they're not physically there.
okay. And so that is what would prompt them to come to your school.
Correct. Yeah, students come to my school for two reasons: either for need, they just need some extra support, whether that's like smaller classrooms, a lower uh, therapist to student ratio, more minutes with their social worker, or for discipline. So if they get in trouble at one of the home schools, instead of getting expelled or sent to a private day school, they come to us.
So how do you avoid then, how does your school building avoid being kind of stigmatized?
We have this talk a lot. The stigma is definitely there that like our school is like the punishment,
Yeah.
um, and that I think a lot of the teachers at the home schools consider my students bad kids. And I think kids come to us believing that they're bad kids.
Mm.
Um, and we, try hard and amongst staff have a lot of conversations on how we can, fix that not only with our students, but among our entire district. Um, because like I mean this wholeheartedly, they're not bad kids. They make wrong choices, but so does every teenager. They they just need they have disabilities, and they need extra support, and they come to us. They get that extra support. Some make it back to the homeschool. Some graduate with us. Um, but yeah, that's definitely a challenge and a struggle for us. And you know, recently this year we've been talking a lot about equity within our schools, and that's something that we really want to drive home with the rest of the district. That we're not a dumping ground for kids who get in trouble, and I think there's more that we can do to advocate for our students to either uh, stay at their home schools, or get them back quicker, or even like go back for a couple classes and do like half and half,
Mm.
um,
So
because
you
it
mentioned, yeah, you mentioned your, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
oh I was just saying because a lot of the students we get are low income students of color who
That's what I was
are,
gonna ask you.
yeah,
Yeah.
who,
So you
who
see
are,
equity and like, is that who gets placed more often than not at your placement? And why do you think that is?
well, it's because yeah, our students definitely get hit like with a double whammy. The students of color are overly identified as special education students, and then they are more likely to get in trouble and have more severe punishments, which would be taking them away from their homeschool and getting sent to us. Um, I think one reason is parents' involvement, or like the stigma that parents of color are not as involved. And I think that's like part of it's a school problem, that I'm sure white kids who get in trouble get more phone calls home with less punishment than students of color. And I think a lot of times uh, a student of color might get in trouble and they get one phone call home and that's it.
Yeah.
Um, I think students of color get identified more for special education just because there's that um, the bias that a lot of teachers have or staff have, and yeah, so our kids end up uh, getting hit twice, with those biases. And I mean, looking at the data, I was actually just looking at this last week. 55% of our district are Black or Latino students, and 88% of my students in my building are either Black or Latino.
Wow. Wow.
So a big disparity there.
Oh, students. I can't wait for us to have a conversation about that bomb that Kevin just dropped on us, because that is not just a indicative of what's happening where Kevin teaches. That's a nationwide issue, um, in public and in private spaces. In private spaces, students just get kicked out. So if we think about the Chicago Charter Network, the Noble Network kicks kids out, and they disproportionately kick out students of color. So, Kevin, help me understand who a diverse learner is. How do you assess um, who is a diverse learner? And then how do you go as a special education teacher go about meeting their need?
Yeah, I think in terms of special education, a diverse learner is anyone who has a disability that makes it more difficult for them to learn in a general education setting. So that could be an emotional disability, that could be a cognitive disability, physical, um, learning disability. Anything that just makes it a little more challenging for them to learn, like their non-disabled peers. Um, as far as assessing for a disability, that's not really my role as a special education teacher. That's more social work, or um, uh, what's the
Psychologist.
yeah, yeah, psychologists. Yeah, they do more of that route. Certain in terms of assessing for the student needs in the classroom. Um, you know, beginning of the year, I give all my students just like general assessments, like reading, writing, math, just to see where their baseline's at, and then throughout the year, continue to assess where they're at, see what kind of growth they're making, um, see like what accommodations or modifications are still needed for them. If a student is reading a couple grade levels behind, then for an assignment, I'll give them a reading level that's at or maybe like just above their uh, instructional reading level. Um, so it varies from student to student, obviously, um, and that's part of the role as a special educator is um, to meet the students where they're at, and to challenge them just slightly more than where they're at. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I'm constantly giving uh, different assignments to different students based on what their level is and where they're at. So it's a lot more work, but it's what's needed because they all learn differently and they all learn um, at different rates, and they're coming in to us with different learning needs.
What's your go-to strategy? What are some examples of like your go-to strategies for meeting students' needs, and what does that look like in the classroom?
Uh, yeah, so like one example that I use all the time is different texts for different students. So um, we just read "Long Way Down" by Jason Reynolds. I don't know if you
It's
ever.
one of my favorite books.
Yeah, it's so good.
So good.
Yeah, it's so good. Um,
And it's accessible because it's like in that short poetry format.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
it moves fast for students.
Yes. Yeah. So it definitely meets that need, and they have a I don't know, it's somewhat new. I don't know when it came out, but a graphic novel
Okay.
version of it. Yeah. So some of the students were reading the graphic novel version, while other students were reading the book, but just the plain textbook. Um, just because some students, reading was a little bit lower than the others, and the less words and pictures definitely help them with the comprehension of
Yeah.
what's going on in the story.
And it's still, I think what people fail to realize, especially with those graphic novels, there's still complex processes going on to understand what's going on. So it's not like you're still challenging students, just not in the same ways.
Right, right. Um, with writing, depending on what we're doing, maybe I'll have some students write a paragraph while other students write 3 sentences. Uh, Giving a lot of wait time. Um,
Mhm. Do you tend to like question different students differently? Like, is that a technique that you might use? Like, if you're talking about a long way down and you're talking about the motivation of oh my goodness, I can't remember the main character's name, about his motivation for wanting to avenge his brother. Are you going to use a different type of question with different students, understanding like their level of knowledge and maybe even vocabulary?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, because not all of my students have learning disabilities. So for the students, especially like the students that come to us for discipline, like some of them, maybe they just have like ADHD or OHI, um, and they're very smart, high level students. So I definitely will give them more complex questions, diving deeper into a text. While in the same class, I'll have students with um, a learning disability, specifically in reading and writing, and I will ask different questions to them, um, but still trying to address the same skill.
Mhm.
So if we're talking about I don't know, theme, uh, I'm still going to address theme between both students, just do it in two different ways, asking different types of questions.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that people don't understand, and students, I really want you all to understand is that those students have to still be exposed to grade level standards and those concepts, but it's incumbent upon educators, and not just the special educator, but all educators, to bring that down to a level that's accessible to students. So let's talk about that a little bit. What's the difference? Because you mentioned earlier accommodations and modifications. And I even remember as a teacher, Kevin, like going through trainings, and I'm like, we've had this training 5 times. Why don't people understand the difference between this yet? So, what is the difference between an accommodation and a modification, and who can get one versus the other?
So an accommodation is um, it's not lowering expectations, and it's not lowering or it's not changing what that student is doing. So it might be um, like extended time on a test. It could be going to a different room for a test if they need, like less people in a room to take a test. Um, it could be the use of assistive technology, or having someone read the text for them, or stuff like that. It's the same assignment or same assessment. Uh, they just need something else to support them in doing the same thing that the rest of the class is doing.
And any teacher could do that, right?
Any
Like for
teacher can
any
do
teacher.
that.
Okay.
And if a gen ed teacher needs help implementing an accommodation, that's where they would go to that student's case manager. So like if I was in a big high school and one of my students was in a gen ed class, I would be in constant communication with those gen ed teachers to making sure that they know what the accommodations are and how to implement them, and making sure that they are being implemented. Um, a modification, on the other hand, is changing the actual assignment or assessment, whether that's taking questions off, so they're doing less work, whether it's changing the text to meet their reading level. Um, let's see, what are other examples of modifications? Changing a grading scale or a rubric for that student. Those are all examples of modification. So it's changing what they're doing for that student.
I know as an educator, as a former middle school teacher, that that is that creates tension sometimes between the gen ed teacher and the special education teacher. Why do you think and okay, so students, like, this is a big, like, this is a real thing, right? Like, teachers get really, I don't know what it is, territorial about, like, special education teachers coming in and modifying assignments to meet the needs of students. Kevin, why do you think there's this tension in that in the modification process?
Probably because gen ed teachers think they're so smart and they have the best lessons. They don't want to change. No, I don't know why gen ed teachers ca- can be, not all, but can be resistant to an accommodation or modification. I think probably because they want things to be fair with all students, or maybe they just want for themselves um, a level playing field to assess the students, where they think that if a student has an accommodation or modification, like they can't assess them the same way, or they might not be learning
Yeah.
as much,
It
or
is still fair though. It is fair because that student has some disability that prevents them from being able to access whatever it is that
right.
necessitates that modification or accommodation.
Here's what I've said for years: getting an accommodation or modification, that doesn't make it unfair. Being born with a disability or getting a disability throughout your life, that is unfair.
Okay,
And
student.
so those students need the modification or accommodation to level the playing field.
Okay, remember that, students. That's a really good point that Kevin just made. And I think one that I want you to consider as you're going into the classroom, and you'll be that gen ed teacher, and remembering that the special education teacher is not your enemy. They're not coming to make things easier for your students. They are coming with a set of knowledge and skills that we don't have as general education teachers, to ensure that their students meet those objectives like Kevin talked about earlier. He has to continually assess his students to ensure that they're meeting their targeted goals for learning. Um,
And I think it's worth saying that if if a gen ed teacher is noticing that the student, doesn't need the accommodations or modification, that's a great conversation to have with the case manager, because those accommodations modifications are put into the IEP, um, once a year at the annual review. So, 6 months later, that student may have made a ton of progress and might not need them anymore. Um, so the conversations between gen ed and special education should happen often, and they should work as a team. And I think in an ideal world, the gen ed teacher can provide the accommodations and modifications on their own. But until they get there, special education teachers and case managers are there to help you out to create those different learning assignments for the students.
yeah, I almost see it like you all have other things in your toolbox that I don't have. And so sometimes just you, and it might just be like an awareness of, hey, when a student has autism, A, B, and C happens. And so just even informing me of that, because that wasn't my area of expertise, is like there's that partnership of learning and understanding on behalf of that student. And like you said, when it works well, it's a beautiful thing, because you do see students exiting special education, which is the goal.
Right. That's absolutely the goal.
Yeah. So I think we just talked about one of my next questions. What do you wish all educators understood about special education?
The special education comes in so many different forms. Before I went to school to become a teacher, I would hear special education and instantly think of like the cognitive disabilities like autism, Down syndrome, um, stuff like that. Uh, but it's so much more. There's kids that if you saw on the street you would think is just a normal kid and never know that that student has an IEP or has a disability, is part of special education. Um, and there's so many invisible disabilities that make school very, very tough for kids. Um, and I think learning about those disabilities and learning how those disabilities present themselves and how you as an educator can make school better for those kids, would be, an enormous help for any of those students. If you guys ever came to my classroom, like, they're all normal kids that you would wonder, you know, these kids are special ed, but yeah, they all have, emotional or learning disabilities that you can't see by looking at them. Um, but has definitely uh, given them a challenge in their educational career.
Speaking of challenge, what would you say is your biggest challenge in your role as a special education teacher?
Um, I mean, there's a lot of challenges. I think addressing all the different needs in my classroom in, one period and every period, every day, that's tough. Um, Making sure that students, basic needs are met. Some of my students are coming in, they living in apartments. They get a 2-bedroom apartment with, 10 people. Maybe they haven't had a meal in 24 hours. Um, so, making sure that those basic needs are met before they could even attempt to learn. That's difficult. Um, I think sometimes the parents, communicating with parents can be difficult. One, because it's just sometimes it's hard to get a hold of parents, whether they're, working a couple jobs, or the language barrier. I don't speak really any Spanish, and we have a lot of Spanish speaking parents. That's difficult. And then specifically for my school, the behaviors that we see, can be very difficult at times. The students can turn on you in an instant and, say some mean things to you, or, have behaviors that are unexpected, and, just not appropriate. Um, and that could be very difficult, but, I don't know, I think seeing them grow from year to year is very rewarding.
How do you deal with that? How do you do? Because I'm trying to think of even just in my classroom. So when I had like a little snot who would say something like offhand one day, like sometimes that stuff stuck with me. I'm like, you little snot that said that yesterday. So how do you? And I'm sure like in special education, you've seen some things that you all are trained to kind of take students down if they become physical, and some students with emotional disabilities do. How do you shake that off? How do you kind of come back and give that kid the ability to have a clean slate the next day, which is so important in your role?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're definitely trained to. We tend not to use the word takedown,
Oh, sorry.
uh, but put students in a hold where they are not going to harm themselves or others. Yeah, we're trained to do that. I've been lucky. I've never had to use that. I think a lot of special education teachers don't ever have to use that. But yeah, I mean, I cannot take anything they say personally, and I don't. And one of my coworkers told me that if we can be their punching bag, then that means that they trust us, and it means that they have a lot of other things going on in their lives, um, that you know, I'm fine with being the punching bag at times. Like if like I've never had to experience a lot of the things my students go through, the trauma that they go through, um, and I mean it doesn't mean that they get away with it. I'll let them vent. I'll let them call me names at times. Let them drain off, and then once they're in a space where they're able to have a conversation about the expectations or what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, then I'll have that conversation with them. Um, and like I mentioned earlier, we have like restorative justice practices at our school. So we typically don't suspend kids um, or
Can you
have any like
explain that to
very
my
harsh
students?
punishments.
Can you explain restorative practices for my students who might not know?
Yeah, so they're it's an alternative to your typical school punishment, um, and uh, it's a way for students to um, kind of like get back into the good graces of the school. And there's a few ways that you can there are a few techniques for restorative justice. A lot of times we use what we call peace circles, and we get some different staff members and students to come together and kind of like share different experiences, um, and validate each other's emotions, and give that student an opportunity um, to apologize, and then to make things right with whoever they harmed, and then if they did damage to the school, sometimes we'd have them stay after and like help the janitor clean up, or help a teacher with some kind of task, do something to better the school community.
Yeah, students, I love restorative justice, and I just want to give homage because it comes out of Native American indigenous traditions of like bringing communities together. So we don't exile people, we bring the community together and we have a conversation and we talk through that harm, and then we talk about how that harm can be righted. And it's just such a powerful practice for students of all ages. And it's something that we need to, as a country, if we look at our criminal justice system, need to be thinking about too, because some harms can be righted right in that moment. And I'm not saying that all can, but a lot can be. I'm glad that your school is engaging in that. And students, I would also say read up on it so that you're doing it correctly and that you're not doing it performatively. I do know some schools that um, have misconstrued what restorative justice and restorative practices are, and you want to make sure that you're implementing it in ways that are beneficial and not just in ways that look good for or are a name only. Kevin, do you have a favorite story that you'll share and end with us on that might connect to your experience as a SpEd teacher?
um, I have a lot of stories. I was thinking all day when you sent me that question, which story I should tell. Um, I guess this one just happened this week, and I think it's pretty funny. On my students' iPads, they have an app for a safety concern. Um, and one of my students he's one of my favorites. I have really good rapport with this student. He was attempting to take a nap in class, um, and and would not drop it. So I said, "All right, I'll give you 10 minutes to rest, get your mind right. I'll set a timer. 10 minutes is up. You're back in your desk. We're moving on with class." Uh, 10 minutes was up. He's not budging. Um, so then he says, "You know what? I'm going to put in a safety concern." and he my principal forwarded me the concern that he put in, and it was something like Mr. Miller's not letting me sleep. I'm about to go off on him, and then he took
He's
a
like, "You're in need of safety."
and he took a picture of me from his iPad and attached that, and he was totally just joking around. He eventually got into his desk, but uh, my principal forwarded me that email and said I gotta save that because it's so funny.
Oh my goodness gracious. Well, that's there's a lot of complex learning going on there because he has evidence to support the fact that's the picture that he sent of you. And he understands his own physical needs. And so he's communicating that with you and negotiating in the process.
Yes.
So, wow.
He threw in a little name calling. He said, "Kevin Chad Miller won't let me sleep."
Oh my students are the best. Like they
It's
are
so
the
funny.
best. I have okay, I have one funny story and then thank you, I'll let you go. I had a student who he was a student with autism and he's eighth grader, was in love with this girl, in love with her. And so, and he fell hard. And so he would go every day to her locker and just kind of stand there. Like he didn't know how to approach her, but he would just kind of stand there creepily. And I tried to tell him, I'm like, hey, you don't want to do that. Like, we could talk about some ways where you can approach her, but don't just stand and stare at her. Like, think about if someone kind of stood and stared at you. And so he had agreed. He was like, okay. And then he had like written down what I told him he could say to her, some talking points. And so I would like sneak and check to make sure that he was not being creepy and doing what I told him to do. And so one day he's there and he's just staring again. And I pop up and he gets so mad at me. And Connor says, "You are the bane of my existence. You are messing up my whole life. I'm never going to get married because of you." And I'm like, hmm, okay. And I came home and he said some others. I can't remember like his exact, like it was like the most theatrical, dramatic thing. And I like had to fight back from laughing because I was like, I feel like I'm in a Disney movie here. And I came home, and so my family for years would always say that to me when I would get on their nerves. They're like, "You're the bane of my existence. You're messing up my whole life." And so Connor like became like this icon in my house because he was able to tell mom stuff that we've been wanting to tell her for years. But it was just so funny. He was like, he blamed me because he was never going to get married because I would not let him stare at this girl at her locker. And I'm like, okay, Connor, I'll take that one. So that's my funny SpEd teacher. Well, thank you so. Oh, last question. Do you consider yourself an advocate or an activist?
Ooh. Um, can I be both?
You can be. Why do you want to be both?
Uh, oh, one, I guess in special education we always use the term advocate, um, and I want to be able to stand up for my students and what they need, and make sure that they're getting what they need. But I guess an activist sounds like a role, like a more active role that you would take, and actually going and I don't know, going to make sure that their needs are met.
Yeah.
How would you define or
Yeah.
differentiate the two?
Yeah. So I think of advocate as like almost like walking side by side with you. And I
Okay.
think of activists as like clearing the way for you, like coming before you to like clear, like, I don't know, like I'm gonna go out and speak on your behalf. Like you won't even have to say anything. Like stand back. Like I'm gonna make sure that this world is a better place for you, even being steps in front of you.
Yeah. Okay. I like those two definitions, and I think there's a time and a place for both, because ideally our students would be activists for themselves, and we'd want them to get to that place. Um, so like in an IEP meeting, like I would hope my students would say, like I need this accommodation, I don't need this modification, and like tell me
Mhm.
what they do and don't need. Um, but there are times where maybe they don't know, and I need to be the person that says, here's the plan in place, I'm going to make sure this happens, I'm going to make sure your education is uh, the best it can be for you. Um, so I think there's a time and a place for both, and I would consider myself both.
Yay! Because even telling those other teachers, these aren't bad kids. These are kids just like any other kids. That I kind of
Right,
see that as activism too, in a sense, and even
right.
in that equity framework, thinking of the activism that it would take to challenge the fact that 88% of your students.
Yeah, it's like being non-racist versus anti-racist.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'm about to cut the recording off. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to stop recording because I have another question for you. Oh, God, do it. Yeah.